So it's April 24th. I'd like to call the Climate Action Plan Task Force meeting to order. As we have done in all of our recent meetings, this meeting will be operated under the revised open meeting laws pursuant to the governor's order suspending certain provisions of that law. We will be making this Zoom meeting information available so others can participate, and the meeting will be recorded and made available. It says it's recorded by Westboro TV, but it'll be posted on their website after I've recorded it. In these Zoom information that you received has been posted on the town website and is also available on that slide. So the first order of business is to review and approve the July minutes. Then we'll have some discussion about what's going on at the state level, in particular with the discussion with the Global Warming Solutions Act Implementation Advisory Committee. I will provide an update on the CAP communication plan, which I took an action from the last meeting to develop a plan, and I'll provide where I am in that and what I'm recommending for a plan after having discussed it with Peter Flynn a couple times. And then the bulk of the meeting is going to be reviewing our goals and strategies and having a discussion on our progress in that space, which is the kind of the core and essence of our work to date. And with that work being complete, we will be expecting to take that to a series of communications meetings. And so the next agenda item after that is to talk about next steps. And then my wrap-up agenda item is just a catch-all of other topics, which I have 3 identified, but feel free to add any other items that are relevant to the Climate Action Plan Task Force at that time if they haven't already been raised. So for the state activities, I want to make sure I had a discussion with Peter about this that may not have been obvious or clear to everybody, but Governor Baker declared a net zero in 2050 as the goal for the state in the State of the State address in January. And through this, he basically took an executive action, which he has authority to do in the Global Warming Solutions Act. As a result of that, EEA took the action to establish a decarbonization roadmap and reviewed the net zero by 2050 goal in some detail in a series of meetings in Worcester and Springfield, and then they went virtual. And that resulted in a letter of determination in April of this year. This changes the 2050 goal to have 2 aspects. One is a net zero carbon emissions by 2050 and a minimum of 85% reductions in the greenhouse gas emissions. So the net is that if you're at 85% emissions, you need to have confidence or clarity that you have sequestration for 15%. Which is quite a large percent and probably not achievable. But the 85% is a minimum reduction in combination with the net zero requirement. In parallel with those executive administrative activities, the legislature has been very active. Both the House and Senate have approved large, complex, I think quite progressive climate bills. And these bills would put new requirements on the executive branch. And I gave some examples such as firm requirements of 50% reduction by 2030 and 75% by 2040. There are extensive documents documenting the difference between the two. When they go to conference committee, you kind of, I guess, never know what's going to come out. But if you assume it's going to be somewhere in between those two, there's quite a bit in of change that is likely to come out this year, and also assuming that the governor signs it. So there is pending legislation. The point of this, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, is that as we go through the end of the year, all of these things become elements that create opportunities as some of this legislation creates new funding sources, new programs that can assist us in the effort, but they also change the goal line. And for those who are anxious to see rapid progress on climate change, they change them in a positive way, in an aggressive change to change the goal more aggressively, faster. One of the attributes, one of the outcomes of the Global Warming Solutions Act was setting up an implementation advisory committee. This is a collection of experts from across the state who work directly with the Undersecretary of Climate Change and others from the, this top of the state administrations to look at strategies and to provide analysis of how to achieve these very aggressive goals that have been established already or are in the pending legislation. We have the good fortune of Dave being on the Implementation Advisory Committee as one of those thought leaders statewide. So with no further ado, I'll ask Dave to talk about the Global Warming Solutions Act Implementation Advisory Committee, and most particularly the meeting that happened a couple of weeks ago.
So Pete, sorry to interrupt, just a point of order, Dave. You made a motion to approve the July minutes and then just moved on. So I'd just move or ask if we could
I appreciate you stopping that. I actually didn't make a motion. I don't think I'm allowed to make a motion. Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
So a second?
I second the motion. Yep.
Okay. Let me try to do an official roll call.
If you would, and then I'll take the members present and absent from that vote. Thank you.
Peter, your vote?
Aye.
Andy?
Aye.
Tim?
Aye.
Rod?
Aye.
Dave?
Aye.
Chris?
Aye.
Okay, all present have voted in the affirmative, and we have a majority present, so we'll approve the minutes. And thank you, Tim, for stopping me.
So noted.
I get excited about the work we're going to be talking about and just zoomed right on.
Me too. Dave, I apologize for interrupting you.
Oh, no problem at all.
Out of the way. We're good.
Yeah. So briefly, from my perspective, it's been a very active time for IAC. Like every other group in the state, we saw a slowdown of work due to COVID, and a large focus at this point has been on how and when reports and revisions are going to be released to the report with regards to our goals for implementation, looking especially towards 2030 and technical appendix that we'll be releasing as well. So we're currently in the process right now voting on what time frame, and if I was to guess, I would say that we're looking at March of 2021 for everything to be released. I think that there's going to be a public period for comment, which is something that a lot of members feel like is important, so that there's a lot of feedback that's allowed from lots of different stakeholders, and also there's a new environmental justice focus, an equity focus that subcommittee brought for our review, and the members feel like that needs to be digested and added to the report as well, with a focus on environmental justice communities. Anybody who heard the WGBH story today about how they're cutting down trees for a bike path in I think it was Roxbury, there's a lot of conflicting, challenging items in densely packed neighborhoods that have to do with heat islands and so forth that were discussed, and it was a good discussion to be had. In terms of my participation, apparently I really like buildings because I'm on the committee here, and I'm on the buildings committee for the state. And we've had a lot of discussion with the buildings in terms of, what is the best approach to get us as close to possible as, as we're mandated by law to reduce carbon outputs for our goals of 2030. And, it's been interesting and a learning experience to hear how little impact you get from energy efficiency as opposed to some of the newer technologies that are coming online with, especially with heat pumps. So to just briefly talk about 2030 and what I see as the direction that the state's going in, it's really heavily focused on heat pumps. They're talking about 1 million heat pumps statewide, and we're talking about a focus on oil with a secondary focus on gas. There's a huge discussion on electric vehicles, and there's again a goal of 1 million electric vehicles on the road in the next 10 years. And the Secretary Ismay feels like we will be participating in the private sector and building these markets up. So it sounds kind of like a shooting for the stars, but really once we have the state incentives in place, the idea is that the market will start building itself up as it has with solar and the creation of solar jobs and so forth.
Excuse me, Dave, I had a question here.
Okay.
What is do you have a sense of what is the percentage of, let's say, 1 million houses equals what percentage of the total housing units in the state, and same thing for the vehicles?
I think that million number was across the board for commercial, residential, and industrial. So I don't have that off the top of my head. It might be somewhere in the presentation, paperwork, which is available.
On the electric vehicles, the million represents about 40%.
Okay, so we have 2.5 million vehicles on the road today.
Yes.
And there's a goal as well of those are lightweight EVs. There's also a medium weight EV goal, and we're talking school bus, some cargo, and so forth. That was a much more modest goal of maybe 2,500 medium weight EVs, but that's a lot of school buses and whatnot.
Yeah, I believe the light duty vehicle classification includes all pickup trucks up to and possibly including like a Ford 250. It's all the 150s and all the smaller pickups, and it's all the SUVs. So it's some pretty big. It's all the passenger cars, I would say.
Okay. Thanks.
You can see some of the goals here. We're talking about electrification, so we're talking about creating new megawatts of energy produced by solar that feeds into the heating pumps. And there's some goals that it's very interesting given the pandemic, how commuting has really been reduced, and that's being worked into these goals as well, so that there's going to be widespread encouragement for people to continue to work from home as a goal, as a targeted goal for reducing our carbon output as a state. So that's not a new goal, but it seems more achievable now that we've sort of proven that this can be done. So you can look at the key metrics that Peter has pulled out there for everybody's review. And just so people know, my expertise isn't on the technical side. I have been involved in working on buildings and so forth, but it's more on the affordable housing aspect. That's how I'm involved, because our group has done work in terms of assisting, over 100 buildings that are low income, accessing clean energy that's available for the state. But it's a great group of people to be a part of. It's very opinionated and high octane. So but we have a lot more meetings up until the end of the year. We're going to be moving ahead on setting those 2030 and 2050 goals, releasing the plans, and finalizing our goals in the individual work groups. And it's really mirroring what we're doing in Westboro. So I feel pretty strongly that we're on track in Westboro and that we're tracking with the state goals, which is ultimately what we're going to need to do.
Thank you. And I'll note at the top, it says 90 by 50. My understanding, Dave, is that the IAC is not using the 85% reduction, but a 90% reduction on emissions for all your planning.
Correct.
Question, please.
Yes.
This is Peter. Dave, I'm looking under clean energy, and there's a 20% CESE. I assume the CES is Clean Energy Standard, but what is CESE?
It's a good question. I don't have that in front of me right now.
Okay.
What is RPS in that same note?
RPS, I assume, is Renewable Portfolio Standard.
Yes.
Yeah. I just hadn't seen the CESE before, so I'm interested. I'll follow up. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll see if I can get an answer before the end of this meeting. I'll throw a quick email out there too. All right.
Great. Thanks.
It would be nice to have an acronyms list.
A lot of acronyms, right?
Yeah, David, this is Andy Kenningsburg. Can you go back a slide, Peter?
This one?
The last one. I just have a question about looking at the clean energy. These are the goals. Do they have some kind of, even if it's not complete, some kind of engineering plan about how they're going to be able to do this? Or are these sort of desirables or desirable goals? So do they have a plan or at least a structure in place how they get to this?
Peter could probably answer that better than I can, but I think that they're planning on utilizing pathways they already have through the utilities in terms of, having the investments through the different pathways that are already established. So I think from what I took away, it was more about developing the actual markets, and you can't just force people to adopt air or ground source heat pumps, but there has to be like a market and incentives to make it competitive. So I felt like that was the main focus of the discussion. In terms of engineering plans for how that's going to be achieved, with there's some really detailed analysis coming out that will look at the different building types, especially. So, like the goals for a hospital obviously are going to be different than a single family residence. So there's some work being done on that will be put out there. And also, again, there's a technical appendix that's going to be coming out that I think is going to sort of highlight some of that aspect that you bring up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know much more than what you've just said, David, and Dave, other than what's on this slide that talks about having technical reports done, and then from that developing the plan, which would include, I believe, policies and programs. As shown here, it's drafting by the end of the calendar year, public comment period, and then, as you said earlier, final 2030 document by March of 2021.
Great. Yeah, it's a very aggressive targets, and I think, but again, we do have a very robust infrastructure in Massachusetts to carry this out. So it's going to have to, but there are some of these same points that are being brought up in our discussions at the state level too. Like, how is it going to be carried out? How are we going to create these incentives? Where is the funding going to come from, et cetera? Well, one of the points that I brought up again and again, even our building group, is that's great that we're going to replace oil and all, but when you pay an oil bill in Massachusetts, you're not contributing to any clean energy fund. So there is no replacement fund available for oil burning equipment currently. I was involved in some legislative work to try to make that happen years ago, but so there are all these glitches, right? But we're mandated by law to, and it sounds like we're going to have an even shorter window given the legislation that's coming down the road to make this happen.
Yeah, and I think between the legislative and the executive branch, they're aware of some of those barriers that have already been found, like the one you just alluded to, and some of that's being addressed in these big climate bills that are being drafted to remove those barriers to change. It is economic impact. There's going to be cost. Big questions in regard to where the money comes from to pay for it all. But in order to make the change at the rate the state wants to do and that and the science says we need to, money will need to be spent. So it's a question of how to make that happen. But clearly, I believe the state is committed to these goals and this outcome. So that was all I wanted to discuss on the IAC and the state activities. Anybody else, any other questions on the state activities?
I had one. Dave, was there any mention of a carbon tax or something of that nature?
That would probably be beyond the scope of this group because that would be legislative in nature. So we have to work within the framework of the existing roadmap and laws. So if the laws change and that includes a carbon tax, that would come to us via the governor's office after it's signed into legislation. So as much as I personally support that idea, and I have a lot of other ones that I've been bringing up, some of them float, some of them don't.
Okay.
In the legislation that I referred to earlier, the Senate bill has mandatory carbon pricing market mechanism. I forgot how they phrased it because it includes cap and trade as well as a direct carbon tax by segment. So for transportation fuel, for building heating fuel and so forth. The House bill does not have that.
Okay.
It's one of the items that needs to be resolved.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Hey, Pete, it's Tim. Just with regard to this CESE, I found a document posted on the Mass site, and I put the link in the chat window for folks. It looks to me, after a very, very quick review, like it's an expansion of the standard. So this document goes into detail,
Great.
and I believe it's right.
Thanks, Tim.
I'll upload it to the share drive as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim.
Maybe you could even just put the link in the minutes, would be good. Okay, thank
I'll
you,
do
Tim,
that.
for that. Anything else at the state level?
That's it for me.
Okay, thank you, Dave.
Sure.
I would like to next go into the communication plan. I talked to Peter and brainstormed how to approach this, and I developed this framework that I've called 3 groups. So I have a group 1, which is the town manager and the master plan advisory committee, and then group 2 would be getting into the committees in town, the Board of Selectmen and the school committee, moving on to other town committees, and then civic organizations. And group 3 is individual, either commercial and industrial or residential discussions. I will be discussing each of those a little bit just to tell you how I'm thinking about it and then ask for your comments and feedback. So in the group 1 category, I think the key point here is that per our governance document that we prepared and presented to the town manager and then the Board of Selectmen, we report to the town manager. So I think it's quite appropriate and valuable for us to have a briefing with the town manager and the assistant town manager with some detail, like an hour-long session where we can talk about dates and progress and where we're going and challenges we anticipate. I would like all task force members to be able to participate. You'd all be invited. I'd encourage you to. I think it'd be useful for all of us to stay on the same page in regard to that activity. What I don't know whether it officially be a public meeting, but I'll let the town manager decide that. But I would invite you all to that. The Master Plan Advisory Committee is another important, I think, kind of preliminary discussion because of the master plan going on at this time and the important relationship we have of trying to stay in sync and gaining the most most leverage, most support, collaboration in the way the master plan is generated and refers to the climate action plan and vice versa. In my opinion, for discussion now, I think it would be useful to have that prior to the Board of Selectmen meeting so that when we go to the Board of Selectmen, we can say we have done this alignment with the master plan and where we're planning to take that. I would, again, invite everybody, but I'd particularly encourage anybody who's on the master plan. Oops, I missed Andy on the list here. Anybody who's on the Master Plan Advisory Committee, and if I missed anybody else, but I believe Amber, Lee, Tim, Parrish, Andy, and if I missed anybody else, I apologize. But anybody who's on the Master Plan Advisory Committee, I'd certainly like them to be present and to be part of trying to help align our work to the master plan.
I don't believe I'm on the Master Plan Advisory Committee.
Okay, well, maybe that's why I left you off. I was thinking you were. Okay.
Just what I need to be volunteered for something else.
No, I wasn't doing that. I was just suddenly thinking I missed your name.
It's all right. I'm being facetious. Don't.
Yep. Group two. So now we're getting into kind of a broader cast, which includes the Board of Selectmen, who we have briefed previously several times. I also sent them the kind of the status update with the greenhouse gas inventory. I assume it would be at a normal select board meeting, and I think kind of a 20-minute slot would be what we would expect. I think it's useful. I was assuming I would be presenting, but the work group leads could also be on the call as part of, in fact, I'm okay with all of the task force being on it, but I think the work group leads should be on the call to address any goals and strategy questions that might come up. The school committee, I would like to tie off with Amber in regard to how to approach the school committee best. I'm basically assuming that they have a minimal understanding of our work to date, that they kind of know what happened at town meeting, but they haven't been updated formally by the task force unless Amber has provided updates. And so I'm kind of caveating this with developing a meeting plan with Amber, similar to what the Board of Selectmen would be presented, with Amber involved in the presentation and at least at an intro level. And then begin expanding the kind of the scope of other town committees and civic clubs. As Sustainable Westboro is being cited to be the execution function for many of the strategies, I think it would be important to get Sustainable Westboro briefed earlier than later. get feedback on that group's opinion and any concern that might come from anything they're being asked to do. The third group is outreach, outreach into the commercial and industrial space, which I'm assuming isn't going to be a big group meeting, but rather more one-on-one meetings with building owners or tenants, major tenants. I think that there is, Peter Flynn introduced a few of us to this company called Station A that I think actually could provide an interesting pre-meeting analysis that we could take into a commercial and industrial meeting and provide some suggestions and maybe even a call to action for that company. I don't want to drive into all the details on it, but I think we could have a meeting where we talk about our climate action plan, but we also have this analysis that comes from the Station A online tool. The number of meetings, I mean, at times we talked about the top 20 customers and all this. I have a list on a future slide. I don't know how many we're going to be able to pull off. I think they're going to be hard to get set up. There may be other groups like EDC or the Chamber of Commerce where we could get more bang for our buck by having some sort of a group process. But I'm not in those circles, and I don't actually know what the potential is there. I am working to try to learn more about that. If anybody has connections with the Chamber of Commerce or EDC, I can reach out to Bonnie Sullivan, and I'm starting to do that. But if you have any particular suggestions on the commercial industrial space, I'm all ears. I think for residential meetings, I think we're going to assume they're going to be all just large Zoom gatherings. I think we should plan different times a day and different days of the week and try to get multiple meetings, maybe 3 or 4. I think they will need to be a little longer, like a 1-hour meeting where there's a little more contextual education compared to, for example, the Board of Selectmen, 6 slides in 20 minutes. One of the goals I think of this is beyond getting feedback, but to get other people engaged in the process where they get involved in the effort in some constructive way, whether they, in whatever way they'd be willing to volunteer, potentially subject matter experts or otherwise. Sustainable Westboro has used all of the items on the bottom for promoting these things and has had some success at getting, 50 plus people to show up for a meeting. We haven't done it for Zoom meetings, so we'll see. Timeline-wise, I had initially thought we should do the Board of Selectmen meeting kind of first and have it in September 8th, but I'm now kind of adjusting that later into September with this group 1 in the first half of September and then starting into the group 2. The group 2's got this long tail of civic clubs and so forth that can go on into November, go on as long as it needs to. But then we should be early in October or maybe even late September, we should be trying to set up some of these commercial and industrial meetings and then residential meetings. So I think that's the basic timeline and in kind of the 3 groups as I see it for a communication plan. I think I have, so this I just put together after meeting with Jim Robbins and John Steinberg in regard to kind of who are the commercial and industrial accounts who they think are big energy users and might be important for us as we try to change the greenhouse gas emissions in the industrial and commercial industrial sector. In the discussion, it was clear they knew some of these companies pretty well. It was also clear they only had a general idea of some of these companies, and so our exact network for how to make these connections isn't really robust, isn't clear to me right now. I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges in our outreach. So kind of going back to, maybe I'll put it on this slide to remind people of what the different groups mean. Thoughts on the way I've put this communication plan together? Do you think it makes sense? Suggestions?
Yeah, I think broadly it does make sense, Pete. There's a lot of details may need to be hashed out on especially the group 2 and group 3s.
I think it might be worth contacting like members of the Rotary who are involved in local businesses. They might have some suggestions on more of the business outreach. Another outfit that I'd put into the commercial industrial is Caruth Capital, who own many office buildings in Westboro. So
Yes.
it's a suggestion.
I think they're very important.
For small businesses, the Chamber of Commerce would be a very good place to sort of socialize the ideas. I know Westboro has a very active Chamber of Commerce.
Pete, I think the structure you laid out here, the format, is helpful. It's certainly I think it's a good approach. It could probably evolve over time, but that's a good start. I happen to be a member of the EDC, so happy to work with you to help communicate this to them. We have a meeting next week where it's not on the agenda, but I could potentially at least plant a seed for future discussions. But I think they're a committee that could be leveraged. Just an example, they do annual awards, recognize business downtown. It's a pretty big event that they hold every year. Probably won't be held, this year, but they'll do something. And potentially one of those things could incorporate recognition for, a company that does something to, work towards what we're trying to achieve through this plan. So I think there's some opportunities there, and I'm just telling you, I'm able to help out with that.
That's very helpful. I wasn't aware of that. How often does the EDC meet?
Once a month.
We can follow up after this meeting, but would it be possible for us to be on the agenda in late September, I guess would be the timing.
So Pete, in my mind, the commercial and
Yeah, I think that's
industrial, sorry. Did I interrupt somebody?
Yeah, Chris, would it be possible, do you think, to be on the agenda a month from now?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely, yes.
We can talk offline about the details, but I think we should try to queue that up. Sharad?
Yeah, so I was saying, they do have different weights, right? For example, the commercial and industrial outreach, I have a feeling there needs to be like a beefy focus group that's really concentrated on that, because the impact of that could be far greater than many of these other groups combined. So the weight of the individual sectors needs to be considered when, organizing the teams or people who would be addressing them.
I agree in regard to greenhouse gas impact.
Right.
In regard to creating the political will in the town meeting and in the management structure of the town, I think residents need to be on board. So
Right.
I think to ensure that the town manager and the board of selectmen continue to stay behind us,
Yes,
I think we need to have strong support from the resident space.
especially as far as communication is concerned. Yes, I agree.
But for pure greenhouse gas effect, the CNI's got to be addressed. And I think it's going to be challenging to do, but we need to do it. So
Right.
I could just say, with the CNI, I also view that as the most challenging. And I think the strategy you have laid out here with Rotary that other people have talked about is one of the best ways in town to get into that community. And if they're not a member of Rotary would know who to talk to. And also, we might want to look at the Chamber 9 and getting a presentation there. I don't know how these groups are doing their meetings these days. In the era of Zoom, it's going to be very challenging just to get any meetings with CNI in town. You know what I mean? I'm not sure. That's an aggressive agenda to try to get
Right. See, so
by December.
I'm in the Rotary Club, and I haven't seen that many representations in the commercial and industrial. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but I just haven't seen any yet, at least the, meetings and gatherings that I have attended. But it's worth asking around and seeing if we can.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch what you said. You said that.
I said in the Rotary Club meetings and gatherings, I haven't seen much representation of the commercial and industrial organizations.
Right. But some of those folks are connected, like Sue Abladian might know somebody over at Caruth Capital, or, there's folks who are Rotarians,
Right.
very enmeshed in the business structure of the town. So it'll be a good thing to reach out to them and use their network to facilitate one-to-one meetings with commercial industrial, because of the knowledge base there.
I'm more in favor of a direct approach. I mean, you have a list of companies, pick up the phone and start calling and finding out, understanding what their sort of decision-making structure is and see if it can be influenced.
in some cases, I think that could be done. I think having Jim Robbins or Bonnie Sullivan as part of the discussion
Yeah.
adds the formality of the gravitas of the town.
Yeah.
What was the other thing I was going to say? On the list is M-Seal Joint Systems, and that's Lester Hensley. So another way is to talk to Lester, who's one of the large commercial industrial companies in town, ask his opinion in regard to kind of how to approach these companies and enter it through his network potentially. And I think Chris Egan at Caruth is not a bad way to have the discussion. Also, I believe he'll be a difficult sell in my discussion. So I see your face, Andy. I had a discussion with him already on this. You know, he'll be, how do I make money on this?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't want to change anything in the way I'm building buildings. All this stuff sounds like expensive ways to build buildings, you know.
Well, it can be on a lower level, not so much building buildings, but hey, I'm gonna put in charging stations in all my parking lots. And he knows that these are incentives for people. They look at that, for example, as a selling feature to get people into their buildings. I mean, they have empty office space right now that they need to fill. Of course, everybody does right now, but this was even beforehand. So it's not so much the approach like, okay, you got to decarbonize your buildings, but there's other things that a company like his could be doing that could add to the overall effort that maybe could dovetail into his economic model where I got to figure out how to fill buildings. So
I think that's I think that's good. Those are good ideas.
So, that's one piece. The other piece is there are institute or companies that use a lot of electricity as an example. And if it can be shown that using solar actually helps them reduce the cost, at least those companies could be, separated into a group and addressed directly. Similarly, so we need to sort of break down these companies into what is possible and what isn't, and what should be short term and what should be long term.
I think my feeling on this is I think we need to spend enough time doing this so that we have a reasonable set of strategies for how to address C&I.
That's right.
In the next 4 months, we're not going to address C&I. We're just going to kind of get a sense of what types of strategies would be most productive.
Right. And that's pretty important, I feel.
Yes. And then it'll take years to engage them and to have projects and to
Yes.
use case studies to show that this project of your neighbor is paying off for them and it can pay off for you. And it's going to be a multi-year effort.
Right. But as long as there's pressure or constant pressure, then, sooner or later, something's got to give.
Okay. That's what I wanted to do with introducing the communications plan, and I'll loop back to it after our discussion on the goals and strategies. Just to level set for people who haven't, who weren't one of the group leads that I sent this to. Let me get this out of my way. So here we are, it's August 24th. So we've created goals and mapped the strategies to the goal. This is a review by the task force before we begin the external communication. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. This is just a repeat of what I'd asked the work groups to do. A little slide that talks about, we continue to have our climate action plan overarching goal, which is now phrased consistent with the state. It's net zero by 2050. And as discussed at the last meeting and at all the work group meetings, we've created a set of goals. There are now 16 sector goals. And for those sectors, there's strategies mapping how we think we can achieve those goals. And there's 48 of those. So for this meeting, and in fact, for any of the meetings in the communication process, we are not going to be able to go through every goal in detail, or certainly all the strategies in detail. So what I'd like to do is to go through work group by work group and have a brief discussion of the 3 or 4 goals that your work group has highlighted and key strategies that you want to bring to our attention without kind of grinding through all of the 48 strategies. I did put this, I put this slide both at the beginning and the end of this discussion, because as we go through these goals and strategies, I want you to kind of have these thoughts in mind. are the goals and strategies in a state where we're ready to discuss these with the Group 1 meetings? Is there any way we can consolidate further, express them more clearly to get ready for public meetings? And really the million-dollar question is, collectively, do all of these 16 goals and 48 strategies seem like enough that we're going to make the reduction in greenhouse gases that we're targeting? And it's really targeting over the next 5 to 10 years. It's not the 2050 goal, because the state, nobody knows how we're going to get to the full 2050, but we need to take off a big chunk, 40 to 50% of it in the next decade. So I want to come back to this slide, but I wanted to kind of put these questions up so that we're thinking about it as we go through the details. Peter, could you talk to the electricity sector goals and strategies, please?
Sure. Thanks, Pete. The electricity working group consisted of Pete Sherrod, Stephanie Kelly, and myself. And we developed, for your consideration, 3 goals with a number of strategies underneath it. Goal 1 deals with infrastructure. Goal 2 deals with energy efficiency. And Goal 3 deals with clean energy. So you stop on this slide. Let me talk a little bit about each one. And please, I welcome comments and feedback or questions. So the first goal is to ensure the electric utility infrastructure supporting Westboro is able to accommodate the electrification of transportation and building heating and the projected additional distributed renewable generation. And this is important because as we go through the goals of some of the other work groups, particularly transportation and buildings, there are goals and strategies that deal with electrification of different functions that are today powered by fossil fuels. So the enabler to do that is to ensure that we've got an adequate electric utility infrastructure developed to keep pace with the additional electrification that is being called for in the other sectors. And so the action under this will be to meet annually with National Grid and town officials, and to the extent that there are any concerns that arise that we have where we're not quite sure that the infrastructure is proceeding on pace we need, to also include the State Department of Public Utilities. Goal 2 goes to energy efficiency, and it calls for implementing energy efficiency measures that reduce electricity consumption by some amount of megawatt hours by 2030 and some amount of megawatt hours by 2050. And the blanks there are quite intentional. At this point, we don't feel like we have the information to develop quantitative goals, but yet we're quite clear that we believe that the direction is right, and that implementing additional energy efficiency will be important to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity sector. So those blanks to be filled in based on additional work that we hope we were able to do over coming months while this plan is still in development. To how to get there, 5 strategies. The first one is to build upon the existing infrastructure of partnering with Mass Save to increase the participation in its energy efficiency programs. The second is really educational for the community in organizing energy fairs for people to learn about energy savings opportunities. Strategies 3 and 4 are to implement actions in the municipal sector to migrate town and school buildings to LED lighting and to convert the street lights to LED lighting. And strategy 5, we've already talked about. We've done it in the broader context, not just in electricity, but with what could be done in the building heating sector, but to hold personal meetings with the large users of electricity and large users of energy in town to gain their support and actually help them introduce additional energy efficiency measures into their business. So those are the first 2 goals. Before we go to the next slide, maybe just stop here. Any questions, comments? by people? Okay, then let's turn on to the next slide then, please, Pete. This is the clean energy goal, and the goal calls for the electricity supplied by clean generation to be 40% of the electricity used in town by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Those percentages, the 40% and the 80%, are the map to the state's requirement for clean energy. And on the slide that Dave showed earlier, he showed the 40% of CES, 40% of clean energy by 2030. I mean, that is the current state goal. And so what we've done is map our goal to the state's goal. And as in other areas, to the extent that the state were to revise its goal, then we would look to come back and revisit this goal as well. So a number of actions on this. The DPW is exploring building a zero carbon power source for water and sewer. We believe that's a viable strategy, and looking to carry that forward. Number two, to increase the Class 1 renewable sources for municipal supply. The town has its own contract for electricity, and that contract does not provide for the same level of clean energy as what is included in the community choice aggregation program that most of the residences in town and some of the businesses in town participate in. So there's an opportunity for the town, for the electricity that it purchases, to up the amount of renewable sources to supplement the contract that it already has. And so that's strategy 2. And then strategy 3 is to deal with this other piece of it, which is the Westboro Choice program that many of us participate in. And just as this year, the town has ramped up the carbon-free, the amount of carbon-free electricity that will be included in the default mechanism, looking to continue to ramp that up in future contract cycles, to continue to lead by example, and stay ahead of the state minimum requirement in the amount of carbon-free renewable electricity that we can offer to people in town through the Power Choice program. Strategy 4 is really geared toward promoting solar in town, and there are existing state programs to do this, the so-called SMART program and the Solarize Plus program. And so this strategy is really to leverage existing state programs to promote renewables in town, and to do more work in developing and implementing an integrated solar strategy. There are a number of ideas that came out on the solar. I think more work needs to be done to pull them together into an integrated strategy, but certainly leveraging the existing state programs is a good place to start. And then 5 is to signal that as a community, we're interested in participating in new technology pilot programs. To the extent the utilities or other entities are looking to pilot new technology, it's an opportunity for us to get involved, both to learn, but also to perhaps benefit from new programs that might be launched. So let me stop, and happy to entertain questions and comments.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. One is the Senate bill has a provision that 100% of the electricity statewide would be from, I'm not sure whether it uses the term clean or renewable, by 2035. So as an example of how far and how fast they want to be changing the environment, not the environment, but the supply of electricity, that's their proposed goal, which would be pretty dramatic compared to our current goals, which you've stated here, which is state goals. one of the key things the Senate's trying to push is to push the goals into sectors. So there'd be different goals for transportation, electric, building, and so forth. So not just have them in the aggregate, but to have them in by sector.
Yep, and I think, as you know, Pete, what we've talked about is as the state refines its goals, that we need to come back and revisit our goals to make sure that
Yes,
Westboro is doing its share.
yes, yes. The last thing on the pilot, I think there's a, maybe it's altruistic goal of people bringing new technology to market need places to pilot it and try it. And I think Westboro can play a contributory role to new technology evolution by being in pilots. And usually they're paid for by other people's money. So it's not an expensive proposition, but it's beneficial for technology development.
Yep, makes sense.
I had a couple of questions, Peter. One question is, in the previous slide, you had that blank about so many megawatt hours. Yes. And you said it's intentional and needs to be filled. Do you have thoughts on how or what approach can be taken to fill that?
Sure, I didn't say that again. Do I have what?
Thoughts on how that or on approaches to fill that information?
I'm not sure what the right approach is. We can certainly look at the amount of energy that's being used today and talk to vendors such as Mass Save and others with regard to what they view as being aggressive targets.
Okay.
But we also need to recognize that as we proceed to electrify things that are not now electrified, more transportation, more
Right.
building and heating, that we could well see growth in the amount of electricity. And so in developing what we think are the right conservation goals, we ought to take into account, what we think is going to happen with regard to the overall use of electricity in town, what we think is going to happen with regard to population and employment growth over the course of the next decade, with the changing climate, even existing air conditioning loads may go up even without anything more. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here that we can start with talking to the existing vendors, but this is where those who are very much involved in the energy efficiency industry, it's an industry unto itself,
Right.
I think are going to be sources of information that we can tap into.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Anything else on the electric sector? Thank you, Peter. Anything else? So Tim, on the building, heating and cooling sector?
Sure, Pete, can you hear me?
Yes.
Zoom's been a little erratic, so let me know if I go off the wire here. So in our building heating and cooling sector group, we boiled everything down essentially into 3 goals. And while there's lots of strategies, there really can be basically explained as either electrifying new buildings and converting existing buildings using fossil fuels for heating and cooling to ones that are entirely supported through electrification. The second goal had to do with energy efficiency. So looking to decrease the amount of energy needed, regardless of its source, across all segments or sectors or segments, I guess I should say, residential and commercial and industrial. And the third was reporting. So adopting the state regulations or our own local regulations that require annual energy building use disclosure across segments. So Pete, if you just roll back to the first, I think, my takeaway, I'll ask for Dave's or Sharad's, but is, this is our building stock. So whether it's a commercial industrial building or a residential, a single family home or multifamily home, change is going to occur from the current trajectory, one building at a time. So when you're building a new building, it's making decisions to that really promote a very tight, energy efficient structure, and one that's largely the environment's controlled through electricity. And those are decisions largely borne by the building owners at this time, using the technologies that we have available today, sometimes with subsidy from the state. But when you look through our varied strategies, essentially what we're doing is outreach activities and communication to engage the building owners in each of in the residential and C&I space. I'm only leaving municipal out because I think we have active strategies to move aggressively in our municipal sector, and they're not going to make the difference in reaching the goal in the long run. So we need to look at these decisions that are made, except for people in existing structures being faced with the replacement of a boiler or a furnace. They're going to be unlikely to put their own money, even if they had it, into electrification or tight energy, into energy efficiency programs. So we need to go out, appeal to them so that everyone that approaches that decision has all the information they need to take advantage both of state programs as well as to make decisions that maybe require some out-of-pocket investment in the short run, but if they understand their utility bills, could lead to savings overall in their household or for their building over the long haul. So I'd leave it there. Everything is really outreach, taking advantage of programs and trying to interdict or influence these decisions that are made by the owners of structures in the two segments that contribute most greatly to our emissions in the structural area.
Question, Tim?
Sure.
The number one, strategy one, enact local policy requiring heating of all structures. Is that intended to refer to all new structures or all structures in town?
I think when we conditioned it, it was for new structures. But I would say, on a certain timeline, that ultimately we would be, looking to convert all structures. Now, our discussions, Peter, went to, on the reporting side, not to jump off of this, but the notion that a house like I'm in, it built in 1862, is not likely to ever, be able to convert to a carbon-free source. Certainly today with the existing technology, but I would say down the road, it may be quite reasonable. I know, just with regard to heat pumps, there's not currently a good replacement to electrify forced hot air systems in homes, but that may change very quickly. And so it may enable us to get there. So I would say this is aspirational in nature, and we're not qualifying it at this point. But when we get down to asking, town meeting or government to enact local policies, they're going to have to be palatable. And certainly new construction is something that's going to be more palatable than requiring people to retrofit existing structures. So
I'm just thinking of the presentations that we're looking on the next couple of weeks that I could see some people reading this to think that the recommendation is that we want to require everybody to retrofit their structure by 2030. And from what you said, that's not what this is intended to do. So we may want to be careful with the language.
Yeah, not when we talked about the detailed, kind of what would be behind it. But again, we're not writing or enacting the policy. So I think the devil's in the details, right? And how we would position this to a public group.
So, Tim, the way this is, the language right now, it does say local policy requiring. And when you described it, you said it's more of an aspirational goal. So I think if it's an aspirational goal, our language should reflect that.
Yeah, I think our discussion though was around changing bylaws and adopting a net zero building code for new construction and major renovation. So there is some fine print below this, but it was more than aspirational when we discussed it, I believe.
So the language needs to reflect that clearly, because if we go, like Pete is saying, if we go with this language in front of any committee, they'll balk and say, well, 100% carbon-free sources for all houses doesn't seem like a realistic goal. So,
Okay, we
Yeah,
flagged that one as, this is good discussion. So we
Right.
flagged that one.
I talk on heat pump will also sort of shed light on this, on, why there are some issues here. So.
Let's go to B2.
Yeah, I would say, does anyone have any comments? I don't need to go through all these. You see the verbs, their outreach, they're implementing programs at the state level. So it's a lot of communication in an effort to influence decisions. So the outreach, to contractors is going to be key, to speak directly to residential customers, roofing, heating. There's a definite accent in here to reach out to multifamily owners, both those that have low-income tenants and are part of low-income programs, as well as just in general, or multi-unit dwellings. So all in the name of trying to promote energy efficiency in those structures. And that's less of a, I would say, in contrast with electrifying your building or choosing to move away from oil or gas as your heating source. These are decisions that could be taken at any time. And I think we can appeal to the return on investment for a building owner, a residential owner of an existing structure, to take advantage of programs and make their home or their building more energy efficient for the benefit it would bring to the bottom line in terms of their utility bills. So I think there's a different economic decision that would promote action, without bounding on, you're needing to replace your furnace or a oil, a hot water, your hot water system breaks, something like that.
Yeah,
So questions?
doing energy efficiency successfully lowers the size of the system you need to do when you do electrification. So it actually can be an enabler for electrification. If you have a more efficient building, it's less expensive to electrify your heating system.
Yep.
Again, this is similar to what we discussed in the electricity, where there's an efficiency program, and we'll work with Mass Save and so forth and promote those types of programs. So the state has good programs. I don't know whether you are aware of it, but for like 8 years in a row, Massachusetts has been #1 in regard to energy efficiency programs nationally of the 50 states. So I think there's a good precedent in the state for progress in these energy efficiency. The exact numbers I can't quote, but I think 20% in a decade is a reasonable goal.
Yeah, I think I've covered this. We're looking to make sure that we have a good information for people, at the time when things are, well, I think annual building energy use for commercial and industrial, for energy disclosure on residential single family homes at the time they're converted.
at the time of sale, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
time of sale.
Um, I had an action out of the last meeting to provide the energy use information, energy use intensity, EUI, for the school buildings. And I sent that to Amber over the weekend. I can send that report to all of you. It was actually pretty encouraging because of the 6 schools, the only one that wasn't better than the state median was Fales, which of course is getting replaced by a net zero building. All the other 5 buildings have a lower energy use intensity than the median of other schools in the state. So I think we have a good building inventory. I think we can start the process of publishing these building energy use disclosure documents for municipal buildings, and create a behavior that can be helpful in encouraging the commercial and industrial building owners to do it on a voluntary basis, and then implement bylaws in the future that require it, as many other towns are doing, and potentially even statewide. This is being discussed statewide also. I think that was on the, Dave, do you know if that was in the slide at the AIC?
I'm not quite sure.
There was some energy use disclosure stuff on there. I just can't remember how it was expressed.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, I think goal B2 in particular is really represents the heart of our work on the building committee. And when I envision what this actually looks like being carried out and implementing this plan in town, this outreach component is just so important. I envision like a paid staff member and a group of volunteers doing the work to get a baseline of energy knowledge into homeowners and businesses and getting them to commit to the programs that are available. And they're changing right in front of us. If you look at the insulation before COVID versus insulation after, it is now a free program. So homeowners don't have to invest any money in order to participate in insulating buildings, getting them up to, the level that makes us an award-winning state for energy efficiency programs. So I just wanted to put that in there. And when we do this, when we finalize this project, I mentioned this in an email to Pete that I think that we should also include some voluntary measures that people in town can take as part of that outreach that we do. So, when we looked at the Concord plan and things like that, we noticed that there was a lot of inclusion of lifestyle metrics in terms of their planning. And so this plan is great and all, but when we go to Target and make purchases, it's still, we're not accounting for that, carbon output involved in the transportation of goods and services in Westboro. So letting the people of Westboro know about carbon offsets and things like that are generally voluntary would be another good tool and strategy I think we should add to any eventual outreach plan. I don't know what we...
One thought I have, thinking about and listening to the discussion on the CNI outreach plan. I think the goals, have correctly targeted some of the largest users of energy. But as we enter into discussions with the EDC and others in town, it would be good to ask them if they aware of businesses that have already taken significant measures to reduce their energy usage. Because sometimes the best salespeople are businesses that have already done things, and they can talk not only the language of energy conservation, but in terms of dollar savings. So meetings not only with the large users, but with leaders that have implemented energy efficiency measures is probably something we should think about.
Yeah, Peter, I would second that. Just as an example, I'm aware that Cumberland Farms has a pretty active energy management group. And given the number of stores and the margins in that business, I know they look quite carefully at anything. So I think you're right. There are many of these businesses, you know, are managing their utility costs as one of their major drivers of expense. And so they both may be able to provide, have already taken measures that others might adopt, but also would move to be good partners with us as we support change. So I think that's a smart one, particularly for the larger ones, which larger companies, which you know, sort of goes to Sharad's point about segmenting that list, because I think we may find energy management groups and, you know, quite a lot of activity in climate, addressing climate change from within their corporate structure, including their facilities.
Agreed.
Yeah, we had a discussion, I think it was in the building sector meeting where we talked about Amazon coming to town in their carbon-free corporate goal, which I believe is fully carbon-free by 2040, if I remember right. I would think that they, for example, might have some best practices and might be willing to share some of those best practices with commercial industrial peers.
It's a commercial for them in many ways, you know,
Yes, yes.
they step out in front and look what leaders we are. So yeah, agree.
Other things for Tim before we move on? Thanks, Tim. Sharad, transportation?
All right, so transportation, basically we have we identified 4 goals, and they are in this slide and the next. And really, after all the things said and done, the one goal that stood out as, you know, the most significant is the conversion from you know, carbon fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles. And there's one thing we had, you know, many strategies to implement this or reach this goal. So that really is by far the most outstanding recommendation that we have as a group. So in order to achieve that goal, the strategies we have are really at a legislative level, pass bylaws that would encourage or, you know, EV charging stations to just make it more easy and convenient for people to be able to convert to this new technology. And also work with State House reps for funding programs to support this transformation. And also work with, so the other big piece is that it is going to significantly increase the demand for electricity. So a car really isn't going to run without the fuel that goes into it. In this case, it is electricity. So we should be, we need to be working hand in hand with the electrical municipal utility companies and other organizations to make sure that electricity is available. And the last one is autonomous vehicles, which is really somewhere in the back, because they are going to come, so we need to start thinking about that before. The second one is really encouraging public transport. This is the second goal. And, you know, in our case, just like all hands of a finger are not equal here, the EVs were far more important, but these others, I kind of liked the term that Dave had just used a little bit ago. He said quality life metrics, lifestyle metrics, and public transport, although relatively speaking it will have less significance, but it is still a very important piece in addressing, or the second most important piece in addressing reduction in you know, greenhouse gases, or just discouraging the use of vehicles in the first place, at least for local transportation. And to achieve that by facilitating public transit systems. Some of this has already started. Chris had mentioned VIA as a service that has been provided. So we just need to do more of an outreach to make sure other people are using this kind of public transit services. So next slide, please. Well, so the third one is really manage traffic flow through the town of Westboro. And this is really one of the large ones is that we have a number of vehicles.
Jump to slide, Pete.
Jump the slide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We have a number of heavy vehicles that have to go from the Route 135 on to 495, and they have to go through the center of town and take the really long route through Route 9 to 495, and there's really a much shorter way to do this. So really, look for strategies where the vehicle miles traveled inside the town, especially for large vehicles, can be reduced, and figure out traffic patterns that would help reduce the VMTs, the vehicle miles traveled in the town. And here we can take help from regional organizations like CMRPC, who actually gather traffic data and use or leverage their data to be able to form sensible traffic changes to be able to achieve this objective. And the last one is really the infrastructure for safe transportation of bike riders and pedestrians through the Westboro and neighboring towns. And this is really, there is a study, and Andy can speak more to that. There is a study that's going on to complete for recommendations on bike paths that can be developed and pedestrian sidewalks. And so the implementation of these study, the outcome of this study would be one of the suggested approaches to achieve this objective. And so this last one was just a thought that, students should be able to bike to school. Students who are living within 1 mile radius of a school should be able to bike to school safely if they choose to. And that is more like a benchmark that could be used to see how the quality metrics, greenhouse gas is one thing, but the quality metrics of lifestyle metrics is as important. And that stands out, at least in terms of the transportation strategies. Any questions?
Yeah, Sharad, my understanding is the town has an existing plan for building out sidewalks. I don't know if the working group took a look at that and whether that plan meets the objectives that you're trying to accomplish here, or whether the push is for something more than the existing plan.
I can speak to that. There was a plan that was put out when Jim Lloyd was still town manager 3 years ago, but it was put together without any public input. So I think that the existing plan is probably going to be revised significantly. Chris Pan can, I think, chime in with what you're going to be, what the upcoming goal will be with, not goal, but he's working on trying to implement the Complete Streets program here in Westboro, which is significantly different than the that sidewalk plan that was put out a few years ago. I don't know if you're prepared to speak to that, Chris.
I guess just in summary, kind of taking step one here, just to figure out what our requirements are and engaging, various constituencies around the town. And part of the program, it forces us, it's a funding program, but basically forces us to put together a priority list. And so that priority list becomes our foundation. And then off of that, it evolves over time. And it's intended to encompass really everything that's listed in goal number 4. I mean, it's going to take some time to develop that, but we're in the beginning stages of that. So, and like Andy said, I mean, the sidewalk plan that was, I guess, a couple of years ago created, I'm sure a lot of effort was put into it, but it's at the level of just a big map of the town with lines on it that, you know, there's significant work to make that into something that's executable and funded and makes sense for the, you know, the town. So I guess the point is that steps are being taken to get after goal number 4 right now, and it's just gonna evolve over the coming months.
Chris, as we exchanged in emails, so the Complete Streets, as I understand it, is a designation like green communities. You have to do something to become a complete street town. Is that correct? And we're in the middle of getting that work done so that we could be designated and available to apply for grants.
Correct. There's different tiers that we have to establish a policy. So the town's going to have a voice in that. The board of selectmen have to approve it. So that process is happening. You know, several steps that occur, but in the end, it does 2 things for us. It forces us to have a process, which is what we need, so we can actually get some stuff done. And 2, it's potentially a funding source through grants on an annual basis that we could use potentially to chip away at some of the things that we're gonna, you know, the town's gonna identify that they want.
So in regard to the climate action plan and not being kind of redundant, I think T4 should be rewritten to say adopt and accelerate Complete Streets program or whatever, and potentially get some, you know, maybe the goal statement is fine, but there's one strategy, and it's to implement the Complete Streets program on an expeditious time frame. And is there anything else that we need? Is that a sufficient statement of our strategy?
So,
For me, I think what is written here is pretty good, and the Complete Streets program itself is just one mechanism we're going to use to get towards these, you know, that ultimately that goal, but even, you know, the strategy number 2 there, or I guess 1 as well.
I'd like to make a couple of comments here. One is that, as I understand, there is a plan that exists that was built, but it really becomes a matter of, okay, it's a map with a lot of lines in it, so what do we do with this? And so now it becomes a matter of how do we prioritize it. I think our second point here actually gives us a cue to that. So what if we start with our schools as being our center points and start building pedestrian and bike paths around that, and basically increase the radius as we go, and add more and more bike paths and streets to it. It helps the students to get to school and the faculty to get to school. And it also gives us like a focal points or a set of focal points in town from which to build out from. And that could reach, start from the schools and reach the local office complexes and shopping complexes and things like that. But I think that a lot of the, a couple of these recommendations actually capture or actually give us a pretty good start on how to approach the implementation of this strategies for implementing this goal.
So I'm good with strategy number 2. On strategy number 1, I'm not clear if the study that's being referred to here is the same study that Chris is undertaking with Complete Streets, or is Complete Streets like a subset of this bigger study that we're talking about? Or maybe we can take it offline, but I think first, I think Complete Streets should be mentioned just as we go to the Board of Selectmen and other places to show we know that's going on. And then be clear in regard to the 2020 complete study. Is that Complete Streets, or is it more than that?
Yeah, I'm not aware of I don't know if number one is something we want to do or something that somebody thinks is ongoing. I'm not aware of any ongoing study on bike paths and sidewalks, but
Well, there were two things that were done. This was the sidewalk plan that was put out a couple of years ago, which, like I said, had no public input. It's just been sitting on the shelf. And then there was the B-Wall Trail study that was done to evaluate this cross-town trail, which said that just putting a trail from one end of town to the other with no kind of external access or branches off it was going to cost several $1 million. And I think since that money was spent, the whole B-Wall Trail thing has been shelved. It would have been from a regulatory perspective, would have been difficult to build. And I've been pushing for looking at bike lanes and going with the Complete Streets plan. So right now, I don't think that there is a funding mechanism to do a complete study on bike paths and pedestrian sidewalk needs. But this is something that we need to do. And I think through the Complete Streets programs, we might be able to get grants to do that, but Chris would know better than me.
My comment listening to the discussion is, just reading the slides, I wasn't aware that there's work going on Complete Streets. It sounds like there is work going on. And I would just recommend that maybe the working group define a little bit better the extent to which you're recommending something more than the existing study versus, what's already in it. I think these goals are just fine. I'm just confused from this discussion about what's already happening versus what you're proposing to happen going forward that's an additional. And I think clarifying that would be helpful.
So let's take this as an action for the working group. I will put together, convene a meeting on this, and we can discuss it and figure out what should be the recommended, what should be the language, and then come up with the recommendation on this.
Thank you.
I was going to make a point listening to the discussion and on kind of a broader level, maybe even a little broader, Peter, than you're talking about. And that's that anytime there's a program underway like Clean Streets, we'll pick on that. But I think there's other things going on in town. And I would just caution us that to Pete Dunbeck's point, we should be flagging the names of things that are ongoing in town when they're associated with or central to the strategies we're recommending, because it just promotes a lot more confusion, among people. And then the stakeholders in the community that may be working on these other plans are saying, well, we're already doing that. And we don't want to be caught without awareness. It's hard not to, but we ought to be well assured that something we're proposing as a strategy, that if there's activity being taken by the town now or by groups within the town, we're either talking about augmenting that or absorbing that or just calling it out as the way to achieve the end result of what we're suggesting is something the town should do.
I think that's my sentiment also, and Sharad has agreed to take an action to try to.
Andy, we'll put our heads together and come up with.
Yep. Yep. Very good. Thank you. And we are within 15 minutes of our target end time, so let me move us along. Chris, you have 4 goals.
Yep, 4 goals. These two, as you can see, are related to open space and trees. I think at least in the near term, it's focused on preserving what we have, potentially long-term, where possible, expanding. But that's a long-term thing based on the nature of the subject. Next slide. And then the second 2 goals, the first, it says, it's a typo there, but should be the third goal that says L2, has to do with waste disposal. So the waste management task force headed by Steve Bakari and a member of Sustainable Westboro has kicked off their work that's been directed by the Board of Health to look at waste management within Westboro. And so met with them. We are aligned with what they're doing. They have activities coming up in September, and I think by mid-September, maybe late September, we should have some good feedback from them on how we're going to flush this goal out. But essentially, they're looking at so these 3 strategies here may adjust a little bit, but essentially they're looking at education, composting and food waste, and then just general waste and the process we have in town for how we are going to like options for residents to get waste, to dispose of waste. And so they're looking at some different mechanisms that exist in other towns and how we could potentially adopt those here. So so the bottom line is that goal is being handled by the Waste Management Task Force, and we're aligned with them. And the last one listed there is about that Pete Dunbeck has mentioned a few times. You can read what it says. It's it's something we need to look at. It's not something we've spent any time on. And personally, I don't think it's something we're going to gain much traction on in the immediate future, just because there's potentially technology things that we need to see evolve in relating to construction equipment and how that's going to play out. But it's an important piece, but it's not something we've had too much discussion about yet.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, in doing the greenhouse gas inventory, it turned out it was 6 or 8%, I forgot the number, of our greenhouse gases were attributed to this. And as Chris suggested, it's not an area that we have easy ways of influencing or there's ready technology to point to. I think the basic strategy here is going to end up being evaluate and adopt statewide programs, and it's going to take years for the state to come up with meaningful programs, and we'll just have to make sure that we're fully implementing and keeping up with the state. I don't think there's anything leading we're going to have to do here, or we will be positioned to do. But it may surprise me. But my feeling is this is keep up with the state, but we need to put some effort into keeping up with the state.
Going back to goal L1, maintain and expand public and private open space. As far as, I was thinking as far as a metric is that, every acre of open space that is preserved is, you could say X number of single family homes that are not built, and therefore these emissions do not occur regarding, okay, I plopped a single family home on an acre of land, or there's 10 acres of land that could have been an industrial facility. So I don't have the math involved, but looking at the greenhouse gas inventory, the emissions inventory we put together, there might be a way to back out what kind of greenhouse gas emissions would come from an average single family home. say, okay, if this open space is taken off the table, then we've basically reduced emissions growth. I have to flesh that out, but it's an idea of how we could establish a metric there to say, okay, this amount of greenhouse gases is not generated. Does that make sense to anybody?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And also, I think kind of building on that, it's, you know, given the goal we're establishing, we can point out that every existing open space that's developed actually puts us a step back in trying to achieve our goal. That rather than move us in that direction, it's makes the rest of what we're trying to do that much more challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think what I could look at, or what we could look at in fleshing this out, is we do have the open space plan in town. We know actually pretty much what's available for unprotected open space. And we can say, okay, if we have this goal, we can't figure out, you know, if we acquire the large parcels that are left, or any parcels, and prevent them from being developed. Even a 1 acre piece of property means one less single family home, for example. These are the way we could get some metrics that we could, you know, look at. Someone might be able to help me looking at the greenhouse gas inventory, how we would back that out. You know, greenhouse gas generation from a single family home, 2 cars in the driveway, whatever. But that's the way I would look at doing the metric on that.
I think it's an interesting idea. I do think it requires a little thought because people need a place to live. So maybe it's the difference between a single family home with 2 cars in the driveway versus a condo and a multi-tenant building, which has a much lower carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think it's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Can I just real quick on, I'm not sure which one was the compost goal. Which one was that? Yeah,
The second L2.
Yeah, so that, you know, that does have a huge impact. That's, you know, not as much as like the electric sector and whatnot, but I just briefly wanted to touch on like statewide, there's been a lot of movement in recent years in terms of regulations of industrial food producers and supermarkets so that the waste is going down. And that, again, if we have like a sort of appendix of voluntary actions, I'm not trying to do like the 80s thing where if you recycle, we'll save the planet, but more like voluntary things like we already have going on with the distribution of water barrels at the library. You know, I think home composting has been shown to have an impact if you're taking that food out of the waste stream. So we should have a policy that reflects what we've already been able to achieve with water barrels and that kind of thing as a town. And I'm just not sure how we could facilitate the distribution of compost bins or whatever. But, you know, I do see some compost pickup barrels that are part of the Harvey system currently. And it's something that we should think about how we could introduce that in a more widespread fashion in town, because it does have an impact on our individual, you know, consumption metrics in terms of what greenhouse gases produce. So
I think composting is really critical in this space. Let me suggest we move on. It's nearly 9. There's some more I want to go through. There were some strategies which, as we were going through the work groups, I kind of pulled off of on the spreadsheet into an all bucket, and I didn't want to lose them. The first one is about the staffing and committee changes within town to implement the climate action plan. The second is driving awareness of the climate action plan within and associated programs within the community. And this is focused on the period of time after the climate action plan has been adopted and the town has declared that we're in favor of the goals. However, fully acknowledging that a lot of the strategies are going to require more time to understand the cost and the implementation details. But we need to drive awareness of the climate action plan, and that just because we've had a Board of Selectmen meeting or the various meetings that were in the communication plan doesn't mean most residents will even know that we have done this. So I think there's this ongoing effort over 4 or 5 years that's going to be required to keep reiterating what is the climate action plan, what are its programs, what's next. And somebody earlier in the meeting mentioned a glossary. That was one of the ideas that came up. I like this idea of having ambassadors who will become spokespeople at community events and so forth. We also need to have an ongoing annual report to show our progress against the plan. One of the ideas that came out early in the discussion was, and it was alluded to in one of the earlier strategies, but advocacy within the state delegation. There are actions and programs that would help Westboro achieve our climate action plan goals. And I think the State House, our reps and senator will find it valuable to get our feedback in regard to what we need to be successful, because it's supportive of the overall state goals. I also included the carbon pricing in number 2 at the bottom under the A3 goal, which we can advocate at the state level, and we can investigate whether there's some carbon pricing mechanism that can be implemented at the municipal level. In consideration of time, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, because I want to make sure we don't go too late here, and there's more I want to cover. Anything else, any kind of important comments on these 3 goals? And okay. In having reviewed all of the goals and strategies, what's the collective opinion, collective wisdom of the group in regard to, are we ready to start the communication plans? Do we have enough beef to begin those meetings? Not that every strategy is totally tied off and tight, but do we have enough? How do you feel about what we have to present to the public?
I have a comment. I think having 16 goals and 48 strategies is way too many. And the more importantly, what needs to happen is we do need to, so now we had prioritization done for each of the work groups, but now that they're all together, we need to prioritize these goals and pick the top 4 or top 5. And in that vein, the slide that Dave had already, even the state is doing that. It's prioritizing. So for example, electricity, electric vehicles, and heat pumps, those are the 3 things that were like the top priority. And we need to align ourselves in the same vein and go down the list, starting with the first priorities and putting more focus on them, spending more time on them, and then going down the list on the lower priorities. That'll make it a more effective communication strategy, and also as we work through the implementation details, it will make it more effective. So that's all I have to say.
Well, I agree with Sharad that there's more work to be done. I'm also cognizant that at some point we want to report out to folks in town, particularly the Group 1 folks and the Board of Selectmen, I'd say, to begin kind of testing whether we're going in the right direction, get feedback from the community. I certainly would not suggest for this next round of communication that we talk about 48 strategies. But I could be comfortable talking about 16 goals and beginning to present those to folks, you know, while making it clear that this is a work in progress, and what we're doing is giving them a progress report. Because based on what we hear back by way of feedback, there may be some real thoughts we haven't had or things we want to change. And I'm a little bit concerned about, you know, the perfect being the enemy of the good here, and, you know, getting our 48 strategies all prioritized, but spending time doing that and hearing, well, we're hearing back to the community is we really need to be doing more thinking on this or something over there. So I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive, but I'd be in favor of beginning the group 1 meetings, focusing at the higher level, you know, of this is what we've learned so far in terms of what the emissions profile is in town. And we've got 4 sectors that we're working on. And, you know, for the longer meeting with the town manager, talking about 16 goals, probably not that level of detail with the Board of Selectmen, but beginning the communication.
Other feedback?
Yeah, I think the kind of going along with what Peter just said, I mean, we may not be at the perfect solution yet for any of this, but the sooner we start communicating what we're doing, I think the more opportunity we're going to have to gain traction on even any of these things. And so we might even find people out there that want to be involved and want to help solve some of these problems. And but if they don't know about it, then they can't do that. So so I think communicating often and soon is better.
Just to go to Chris's point, we had a couple of people show up at our last meeting, like just found out about this and we're all ready to jump in, which I thought was pretty amazing. So yeah, we got to get more involvement in fleshing these things out. We may not be able to do all 48 strategies when it comes to looking at things. There are strategies that we're looking at that are probably not going to have a huge impact regarding greenhouse gas reduction, even though they're good things to do. I know that kind of thing came up with in the transportation group, and certainly discussions we've had in the wasteland and other. So just 2 points to keep in mind here.
Yeah, I kind of, before I put all the goals and strategies in one slide deck and kind of stepped back and looked at them, I was feeling like, wow, we got a lot more work to do. But when I put them together, I said it tells a pretty good story. It's worth going out with this story and beginning the discussion, kind of in the spirit of what Chris and Peter were bringing out. I think there's great value in taking it out. The 48 is way too much to be discussing, and kind of, I mean, you could pull a few of those strategies as little examples of how you can make progress if somebody pushes on a goal. But I think holding it at the 16 topics, I think that's manageable, and I think we're doing pretty well and good enough to begin the community discussion.
I'm thinking prioritizing the goals would be very helpful. There could be 16 goals, but prioritizing them in the order in which the discussions take place, that could actually go a long way in, orienting everybody in the right manner.
In regard to prioritizing, as I was going through them in each of the sectors, I did have my own mind going to which one's the most important in this sector, which one's second. So I think we can kind of shuffle the numbers and put them in the intuition priority order without doing a lot more analysis.
Right.
For example, transportation, the EV, you made that clear. I totally agree with that. I think it should be goal number 1.
Right.
And make sure that gets discussed.
Right.
And then you get down to the other goals that are within scope.
Same thing in building and heat pumps really sort of take the lead. So that really becomes a higher priority, needs more discussion.
So
And
I don't think that's I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think it's a good idea. And it kind of came to mind as I was just working through the goals. I left them in the same order they were on in the sheet, but I did feel like some of them could be reordered to make sure the most important ones are first.
Right.
Pete, I would just say I support moving forward, and I think that doesn't matter how big this document is. Most of the people we're going to be talking to are generalists. They're not going to have the level of depth or interest in this issue. And prioritizing is a good idea, but it's mostly going to be in how we present the information in like one-to-one and person-to-person sessions, that we don't get too mired into the details and that kind of thing. But that, again, like reflecting on what everybody else said, we begin the communication, we attract their attention amongst the many other things that they're looking at and dealing with as a community, that it's really going to boil down to how we relate this to them in a concise, bulleted fashion in a meeting. So eventually we might want to have some kind of PDF that just sort of highlights the highlights of the report that we can hand off to the different stakeholders, so that almost like an executive summary that we have that allows them to sort of just digest what it is that we've done over these last several months.
Yeah, I think one of the thoughts on, for example, the Board of Selectmen, if you're going to try to talk to them in 6 slides, you're not going to be able to go through all these 16 goals. But you could have a briefing package, which you send them in advance, that talks about the goals and provides more detail. And then you actually, in the meeting, you only present a summary level view. And if they chose to read the briefing package, they may ask you questions off of that. But I think there's going to be different styles of presenting it at different contexts in different situations. So I'm on board with going forward. Next steps, I will schedule the town manager, the master plan and Board of Selectmen meeting, and follow up with Amber on the school committee meeting. And that will kind of set the cadence and begin drafting presentation material for distribution to you all and feedback, and probably want to do a dry run of that, which we could do eventually at the next meeting, depending on when those meetings get scheduled. Work group leads, I'd like you to continue to flesh out the details of the strategies and goals as we were discussing. I'm going to skip to I'm going to create a refined form of, okay, so here's, there was things we were doing on the fly where I kind of took some work Peter had done in electricity, and it had a cost thing and a greenhouse, a reduction metric and stuff. We refined it on the fly. I'm going to try to write that all down so that we're all working to the same kind of template. One of the other things that I would like to at least discuss is beginning to form a team to look at what drafting a plan is going to entail. Dave just mentioned PDF for executive summary and so forth. So I think there's going to be elements of all of that that are going to be needed. My goal in kind of getting that started now is so that the work group leads are going to have to write sections of this in support of an overall plan, a document plan. And I think the sooner we get the work groups understanding what the overall document plan is, then they don't go off in one direction when we're thinking the end state is in another direction. I did have a discussion with Andy in an email exchange. Andy is willing to provide some leadership in regard to technical editing. I would like to participate in kind of coming up with the framework for how the document, what the document looks like, and having a discussion of that. If there's others who want to be involved in that, I think Andy and I will try to get together between now and the next meeting and start giving that some shape of what the document looks like. We've had previous discussions of the table of content and stuff, but then coming out of that in September and October, I think people should start writing sections of it, like writing a strategy description document, or that we should begin the writing process. I think it forces us to think in more detail, and that's helpful. We don't want to do it before we have enough of the community feedback, because we don't want to be wasting time. We want to do it based on priorities, as Sharad was suggesting. But I do think we should have a framework that we're working within as we're starting to write sections. Andy, did you have further thoughts on that? We didn't really talk. We just kind of email exchanged.
Nope, not at the moment. I mean, we have, from what I've seen, you know, transportation that Sharad put together, which he did a great job, and wasteland and other, there's a lot, there's at least two different formats, thinking of the way, two different formats I've seen so far, the way the information's being presented, and we have to, we got to get that unified. Yeah, Sharad was great with tables, but I'm not sure that tables will be perfect everywhere. So we have to flesh all that out and figure out the best way to present the information. I got to take another look at some of the other towns and what the reports looked like. And I think one of the things I don't recall, but I think we had, some people have mentioned which towns had done a very good job putting their reports together. And if I can remember which ones they were, Pete, you probably know better than I do. I don't want to get into it right now, but we should be looking at those as examples of how to.
I'll make a note and follow up with you on that. I had opinions of which ones I thought worked.
Okay, yeah. So I'll review those, and then we can start thinking about how we want to put all this together.
I can also send you a couple of suggestions on that.
Great.
Okay. Enough on that for today, and thank you, Andy, for offering the help on that, and I'll be following up with
All right.
my opinion of the other towns. The other material, I had three things I wanted to bring up. Email. Peter, did you have anything else you wanted to say on the email?
Only that of the email I sent out yesterday, I've heard back from a number of people. I'm going to assume everybody received it, but let me just take a survey. Did anybody not receive the email that I sent out yesterday? Okay, very good. Then unless the group objects, I'm going to go ahead and work with Mark Stockman of the town IT and try to put together this email alias for our work group.
Yes, thank you. Sharad has graciously put together a presentation on air source heat pump costs, and he's told me he's ready for a discussion. And I think it's it's kind of one of the fundamental topics for our plan. I think it's important for us to understand this, not just from the state level, but from the local resident view of what's it mean to a homeowner.
So I think it's more general than that, Pete. If you just say heat pumps in general, that cover it a little better.
Okay. Sharad, for our discussion, we're going to try to get a meeting together in the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
And you'll all be invited. You're able to, if you're able to participate, it'd be useful for everyone to hear how air source heat pumps impact. I'm sorry, I keep saying air source. All heat pumps impact, and heat pump technology impact homeowners' expense and Sherrod's experience in shopping for one. The next
So I would
meeting,
consider this as a dry run, and it could actually be one of the, pieces that would become part of the larger outreach program that the CAP would need to.
I totally agree, and I'm pleased to have that as an asset and as a tool we can, as we roll out our program again, heat pumps and electric vehicles are going to be some of the key tools for change. The next meeting is scheduled for Monday, September 7th, which happens to be Labor Day. I'm proposing moving it 1 week out to September 14th. Is that acceptable to folks?
Yes.
Yes.
Works for me.
Okay, is it unacceptable to anybody? Okay, I will change that officially and send everybody an email confirming that. I had nothing else. Does anybody have anything else for today's meeting?
No.
Nope.
Okay, thank you all. Very good discussion today. Good meeting.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.